Laura, you can tell people a little bit about what to expect in the episode. It'll be me doing that. Malky tells people about the questions, and then you can say what we did actually cover. Law?
Yep.
We now have two Malkys, and that's a lot for me.
Thinking about what I was going to say.
How did that feel to watch somebody else doing that?
I was like, yep, that seems appropriate.
Yep.
I didn't quite catch what you were saying because I was thinking about what I was going to say.
The Malky curry story.
Hey, so this is that part before the podcast. We're all going to say hello later, but this is the part before that we record after we've recorded to tell you what's coming up. And it's very confusing, and I never really understand the timeline. But Malky, do you want to tell the people?
Hey?
We've been talking about this for 10 minutes. What we're going to say in this exact moment.
I thought you were coming to me about listener questions.
Yes, that is what I'm coming to you about.
Okay. So we're taking social media by storm, as you probably all know, dear listeners. As you've seen.
The viral trendingness.
We're trying to be slightly more active. So we asked for your questions on the Instagrams and the Tick and Tokens. And we got some questions in. So one was a dear listener who's a genuine listener who happens to be my brother. And I mentioned that on the show. And Jonty was like, oh, I'm okay, fucking hell.
In that accent.
Yeah. But then weirdly, we also got a question from Hannah, and she asked the same question. So we inadvertently asked the question. The question was asked as well.
But we didn't give any credit then to Hannah, but we're giving it to her now. So thank you, Hannah, for sending in that question.
And she's a big fan of the show, which is lovely. Ian didn't say that. So
fuck that guy.
Fuck that guy. Anyway, enjoy your next family gathering, Malky.
And there was another question from Kenny that we didn't get to because we only had an hour. He wanted to know what football team Simon supports. But we did talk about getting Simon back on. So, that'll be top of the list.
Yeah, I think so. Because when we stopped recording, Simon was telling us all about this cool stuff about the history of Baptist churches in Oxford and being related to the New Model Army, not the band. And that's pretty cool. So we may actually get him back on and talk about history. So if you're interested in that, tell us that you're interested in that, and then we will do that thing.
Yes. Okay.
Laura, what should then
Laura, that part that we discussed, you say.
What we actually also talked about on the podcast was we had Symon Hill, who is infamous for, in the last 2 weeks, for getting arrested in Oxford, and we talked about his thoughts and feelings around that, how that was for him. Spoiler alert, not great. Just thoughts on protest and monarchy in the UK at the moment, and about kind of how Christianity and monarchy fit together. Do they? Find out. Listen to the podcast.
Nice. Great trail. We also talk about some non-alcoholic beers and countries you can get them in. So, stay tuned for that.
Recommendations.
So, here is the episode. Hey, welcome to Beer Christianity. My name's Jonty.
I'm Laura.
And I'm Malky.
And with us, we also have Symon Hill. Hey, Simon.
Hello. Good to be on the podcast.
So we've had you on the podcast before, obviously, but you didn't know you were going to be on the podcast when I spoke to you. I just used the
this is the case for about half of our guests.
It is.
Well, it was fine by me.
Excellent. But it's so nice to have you actually on the podcast, and thank you for taking the time. It's been a weird week for you, I imagine.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on. It's a privilege to be here.
Oh, that is kind. Could you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you're currently doing?
Yeah, my name's Simon. I teach history part-time in adult education, and I work part-time for the Peace Pledge Union, which is a pacifist campaigning group.
And you've also written a book that is released since the last time we kind of spoke about you and the stuff that you've been doing. Tell people the title of the book.
Oh, well, thank you. My latest book is called The Peace Protesters, A History of Modern Day War Resistance. And it's about peace activism in the UK since about 1980. So the last 40 or so years. And it's published by Pen and Sword, who are a history publisher.
So how's your last week or so been, Simon? Anything significant happened to you? I'm sure, we've all been pretty chill, I imagine. But how's yours been?
Yeah, there's been a few significant things. I met up with an old friend in Oxford who now lives in Edinburgh. I hadn't seen her for ages, and that was good. I also got arrested for expressing an opinion in the street and spent about 4 days doing media interviews about it. So I'm glad to say that isn't my typical week.
Would it be a stressful life if it was? You're the person who we saw in the news, and there was a lot of coverage of, because it was, well, you tell the story of what happened.
There's so much. I've told this story so many times now, and it's really good actually to be here where I can really mention the Christian element of it because that's the bit that tends to get edited out with the more sort of secular media interviews, understandably, because they're having to adapt what they're doing and cut it down to fit it in a small time slot or a small quote in a paper or whatever. But I was at the church I belong to in Oxford on the morning of Sunday, the 11th of September. It's a Baptist church in central Oxford. And when I came out of church, the roads were, many of the roads and pavements were cordoned off. There was a lot of confusion. There was police around and security guards because Charles was being proclaimed as king. He'd been proclaimed in London the day before, and then the day after, Sunday, proclamations were read out around the UK. Hundreds of years ago, I think that's probably how the news would have been formally spread, but it's still it's still done like that. I think most of us didn't know that until it happened. Certainly in central Oxford, there were some people who'd come for the sake of seeing the proclamation, but I very much got the sense that most of the crowds were people who happened to be in central Oxford anyway, because they were going to the shops, going to the pub, they were walking home from church, whatever it might be. And there was a lot of people asking the police what was going on. There was a lot of confusion. But some were undoubtedly there to watch the proclamation. And it was quite crowded because the roads had been shut off for the procession, which had already happened while I was in church. And then as I made my way back in the direction of where I'd go home, it was quite crowded. It was unclear what was going on, but I got into near Carfax Tower. Any of your listeners who know Oxford will know Carfax Tower. For those who don't, it's basically the big tower in the middle of Oxford that traditionally marks the city centre. And this temporary stage had been erected outside the tower. And on the stage were all these blokes in medieval costumes, basically, possibly early modern costumes. My knowledge of the history of fashion fails me at this point.
That's such a history teacher's thing to say.
I know. Anyway, in formal ceremonial clothes, the High Sheriff of Oxfordshire, the mayor, various local bigwigs, along with military leaders, in their uniforms, and the Anglican Bishop of Oxford in his robes and so on. And they were on this stage ready to read out this proclamation. And I was fairly near the back of the crowd. And I was, I knew this proclamation was going to happen. I hadn't realised it'd be such a big thing. I had vaguely thought about finding out whether there was any protest at it that I might join in. But to be blunt about it, I've not been very well the last few months. I was lacking in energy. I needed to choose my battles, as you might put it. It's not a metaphor I particularly like, but you know what I mean. So I hadn't really planned to protest. But when I got there, I thought, well, shall I just carry on home or shall I stop and listen? And I was in two minds about this. And then the proclamation started. And the beginning of the proclamation, read out by the High Sheriff of Oxfordshire, it began with expressing grief and mourning for Elizabeth, for the previous monarch. And I didn't object to that. I have some problems with the way that the mourning has been observed nationally, as I know you were talking about last week in your episode. But of course, I wouldn't interrupt an act of grief or mourning for somebody. I wouldn't intrude on anybody's grief. But after that, they began proclaiming that Charles was now only and rightful liege lord. And, a liege lord is someone to whom you owe obedience and submission. And said that we owed him obedience with humble affection. And I found this really hard to stomach. Charles is not my only Lord and King. I hope Jesus is my only Lord and King. And I fail to follow Jesus all the time. I don't for a moment claim to be a better Christian than anyone who has a different view to me on the monarchy. But I couldn't acknowledge Charles as my only Lord. And indeed, I don't understand why one person should bow down to another person and accept them as their Lord and King and call them Your Majesty and all this. So I called out, when they announced Charles as our Lord, I called out, who elected him? And contrary to what's been said on social media, this didn't disrupt the ceremony. I didn't shout over the speaker. The speaker had a microphone. I was at the back of a crowd. There were several hundred people between me and him. Most people couldn't even hear me. Even the Oxford Mail live Twitter feed said there'd been an indistinct heckle. So, it wasn't, it wasn't really heard other than by people very near me. And a couple of them turned and told me to shut up. I said, head of state's being imposed without our consent. Why should we bow down to him? Or something like that. I can't remember the exact words. And then these security guards appeared right in front of me. Like one of them was standing like almost nose to nose with me. Told me to be quiet. I asked on what legal authority I was required to be quiet. And then they started physically pushing me backwards. I'd say it was an assault, basically. And then the police intervened. Now, they might have intervened to stop them assaulting me, but clearly that isn't what they were doing. They intervened and said said to the security guards, we've got this, or we've got him, or something like that. They took hold of me, turned me around, marched me down the street, told me I was under arrest, handcuffed me. And while this was going on, it was all very, very confusing. There was lots of noise. There was the proclamation was continuing and was then followed by the band playing God Save the King. There were a few people sort of welcoming my arrest, but there were two people, two older men who were following the police and me down the road and saying, why are you arresting him? He hasn't done anything illegal. And they were saying, I don't agree with him that he's got a right to free speech. And I don't know who these men were, but I really appreciated that because they'd been there cheering the monarchy, but were appalled that somebody had been arrested for having a different view to them. And I really, really appreciated that. But then I was handcuffed and put in the back of a police van. And all this was over in between when I said who elected him and when I was in the back of the police van. I doubt it was more than 5 minutes.
Was that scary? It's not your first time being arrested, but was it scary?
It's not my first time being arrested, but it was scary. I have been arrested before when engaged in non-violent direct action against the arms trade. And it's always scary. But what was scary this time was that it was so unexpected. So the first time I was arrested, I was part of a group of Christians who blocked one of the entrances to the London Arms Fair in 2013 by kneeling in prayer. Now, we were found not guilty, and I have no regrets about that. And I don't think we should have been arrested, but I wasn't remotely surprised to be arrested.
Yeah.
That's what I thought was quite likely to happen. And so I had, to some extent, mentally and spiritually prepared myself for that and prayed about it and so on. Whereas this time, I wasn't even doing direct action. I hadn't even planned to protest. I didn't even have a placard or a badge or a T-shirt that was anti-monarchy. I had literally said 2 or 3 sentences in the street and got arrested. So what was scary was the unexpectedness of it, the lack of preparation, and how quickly it happened, and the fact that the police didn't know what they were arresting me for. Which sounds comical, but is also really alarming.
It's terrifying.
That because technically, legally, if you're arrested, you're supposed to be told straight away on the grounds for your arrest, as well as your rights about it may harm your defence if, etc., used in evidence, etc. They said all that bit, but it was so noisy with the band and the proclamation, and my hearing's not very good. I'm awaiting a test for hearing aids at the moment. And I couldn't hear what the policeman who said it had said. And I said to him, is this under the new bill that was passed this year? Which is for listeners who don't know, I know many will, but for those who haven't followed this or are outside the UK, the new Police Act that came in this year introduces a lot more police powers to restrict protest. So I said to him, is it under the new bill that's just come in? And he said yes. Then when I was in the back of the police van...
Did he say did you see the... Oh, yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, that's exactly,
yes, that's exactly how he said it. He said yes. He just said yes.
Sure.
He was holding my right arm at the time. It was I know it's a sign of middle age that you think the policemen are young, but it's a particular sign of activist middle age when you think the policemen who are arresting you look too young to be doing it. But he said he said yes, and then when I was in the police van, I kept asking the copper who was with me what law had been arrested under, and he said he didn't know, and he said the sergeant who arrested you will know. It was only later, just before I was released, that they told me I had been arrested under the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which is that one passed this year. And they told me that before I was released. But then later that day, when the Oxford Mail, the local paper, called the police and asked the police for a comment on my arrest, they said I'd been arrested under the Public Order Act 1986, and they've continued to say that to journalists ever since. So they've contradicted themselves.
Well, they've lied at some point, either to you or to the press.
And or they just didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, but even so, lying to cover not knowing what you're doing is still lying.
Absolutely.
It's terrifying that they would change their story afterwards anyway, because this is exactly what totalitarian regimes do to crush dissent, right?
Well, I think it's arbitrary arrest. I think, whatever view you take of the monarchy or the police or anything, in a democratic society where people's rights are observed, if somebody has to be arrested, then there needs to be clear grounds for that arrest, and the arrest has to be carried out under a law that allows it. And if the police can just arrest somebody at random and then make up the reasons later, then that is arbitrary arrest.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's concerning is it's not even the changing of the story. I think that the thing to me that is, I think, not even just in your story, but the other stories that have kind of come out of the people being arrested, it's like the moment that there is any kind of disruption to a service that's been, or service or a proclamation or whatever event around this whole scenario, it's been straight in there, arrest, get them out of the situation, which just, it's so concerning, because like you say, they didn't even know what they were arresting you for. It wasn't even the fact of it wasn't a conscious, it wasn't this man is breaching the Courts and Sentencing Act, whatever it's called. It's, this man is causing a disruption, we must remove him immediately.
Yeah.
It's not even that he's causing a disruption. It is the content of what he's saying, because nobody got arrested for shouting in agreement. Nobody got arrested for being pro. It's only if you were anti. And I think that's the thing that in a free democratic society is unacceptable, right? If you're only getting arrested for disturbing the peace if you express one view but not its opposite.
Absolutely. And if there's a disagreement between two people or two groups, even if one of those groups is bigger than the other, then it becomes, in some people's eyes, normal that the one who is expressing the dissenting opinion is blamed for the conflict. And Martin Luther King wrote some interesting stuff about how civil rights campaigners in the US kept getting blamed for causing conflict. And he said, we weren't causing conflict. The conflict was already there. We were bringing it to the surface. But if you pretend there's no conflict, if you pretend everybody agrees, then the person who points out that not everybody agrees is the person who gets blamed for starting the conflict. And so the idea that there was unity, there was peace, everything was calm, nobody had a problem with anything until I shouted out, it is based on this false premise, this shallow understanding of peace and even shallow understanding of order and unity that suggests, as long as nobody's vocally disagreeing, then, we're all fine. And it's the person who vocalizes a different opinion who is to blame for the disagreement. And even then, why is disagreement such a problem? Disagreement in and of itself is not a bad thing. How we handle it may or may not be a bad thing, but pretending we all agree when we don't doesn't really help anybody except for those who benefit from the view upheld by the supposed consensus.
And by the status quo, which is
Indeed.
often, as we know. Yeah. I also think in your case particularly, it's not like it started a fight. It's not even like they can say, well, you made these guys now try to beat you up. It wasn't that. People were like, hey, shut up. That was it. Have these security guards and police ever gone to a comedy gig? Because I think they'd be super alarmed,
Yes, I think so. One of the things that people have said on social media a lot is I've had a lot of tweets from people saying, oh, they probably arrested you for your own safety so you wouldn't be beaten up by people there. Now, I don't have such a low view of the average royalist's temper as they do, as I think most people there would not have beaten me up. A few, I don't know. But
I don't know if anyone's been in the centre of Oxford on a Sunday morning. It doesn't really give screams like mob vibes.
No, it doesn't. I think the only people who were remotely aggressive or violent were the security guards and the police. They never suggested they were arresting me for my own safety. Nobody looked like they were going to beat me up. But apart from that, surely if a group of people are going to beat somebody else up, then it might be expected the police would arrest the people doing the beating up rather than the person being beaten up.
Indeed. For whatever reason, actually. Again, if you live in a free society.
And it's it's so preemptive. Like often I know people that have been in difficult kind of domestic abuse situations, and part of the difficulty there is if nothing physically has been done, then the police can't do anything about it.
Sure.
That's kind of how the law works. But here you're saying, oh, he may be joined by 100 friends and they might start getting physically violent. It's so speculative.
Yeah, I mean, anybody, again, there were people defending it on social media who were saying, oh, well, for all they knew, you might have got violent. Well, anybody might get violent. You don't go around arresting everybody in the country on the grounds that they might get violent.
Have they seen the stats of policemen? Well, they should arrest each other immediately.
Well, quite indeed. But the idea that somebody who objects to the status quo is more likely to be violent says a lot about the prejudice behind those comments, I think. Anyway, I was de-arrested, as they say, which I think means not they don't bother taking you into custody. They tried to get me to do a voluntary interview. I asked to have a lawyer present, which I think is pretty basic. And then I think they decided it would be too much of a faff because they decided to de-arrest me and said they'd contact me and ask me to come in for a voluntary interview when I could bring a lawyer. And they contacted me, I think, 3 or 4 days later, and asked me to do a voluntary interview, and I politely, voluntarily declined. It is a voluntary interview, and given that my experience of the police, especially on that occasion, and given that the only crime I was aware of being committed was the crime of assault by the security guards and wrongful arrest by the police, I didn't see there was much to be gained by agreeing to a voluntary interview. So I replied and politely said I would not be attending. They haven't responded to that. But I am now, I have arranged to speak to a lawyer about a claim for wrongful arrest.
And what's the reaction been from the various media outlets that have spoke to you? And because to us it seems like, wow, this is shocking. Is that the universal reaction?
Yeah, it's varied. I think it's really hard for me to keep track of because I had no idea how big a thing it was going to be. I got home on Sunday afternoon. The police gave me a lift home, and I'd never bought a return ticket on the bus if I'd known that was going to happen. But the police dropped me at home, and I live in a housing cooperative, so I live with there's 8 of us, all adults living in the house. So it was very supportive, and people made me cups of tea, and that was really nice. It took me a while to recover. Eventually, I tweeted about it, and I had quite a few responses to the tweet. And then the Oxford Mail contacted me, and then the Guardian contacted me. And even then, I hadn't expected it to be particularly big. It was only when I got up on the Monday morning with the naive thought that I might go and have a cooked breakfast to calm down from the experience that I realized how many messages I got and how I couldn't read all the tweets that I'd received because there were too many of them. Altogether, I got 3,500 tweets in response to my original tweet. My number of Twitter followers doubled in about 3 days, I think. And that's not as exciting as it sounds. It wasn't, I'd rather it hadn't happened. To be fair. People accusing me of doing this for the sake of the attention. Well, I had no expectation that I had any remote chance of being arrested. So that doesn't make sense. But, the attention wasn't worth it. So I rushed around doing a lot of media interviews. And generally, most media outlets gave me a chance to put my case forward. PM on Radio 4, Jeremy Vine's show on Radio 2. In terms of newspapers, it was mostly the more left of centre papers. And they did ask challenging questions, as they have every right to. Most commonly, was this the right time to do it? Shouldn't you have waited till after the funeral? And I'd emphasise that I didn't criticise or interrupt the any words relating to mourning, anything relating to Elizabeth. It was solely the proclamation of Charles. And in social media terms, I got, of course, I got abusive messages. My favourite one was one telling me I should be hanged for treason. Wow. I can't be upset by that because it's just so silly. Like, how to upset me? Say something personal about it. Saying I should be hanged for treason is just ludicrous.
But also just like hanged for treason for suggesting something basically democratic.
Oh, quite. Yeah. It's there are still people who think that. And then because it was reported I'd called out who elected him, I had messages saying things like, "Kings aren't elected, you moron," which possibly people had. What I particularly remember on Twitter, somebody tweeted me and said, "If you'd paid attention at school, you'd realise that monarchs are not elected. You should have paid attention at school and then you wouldn't have got arrested." And somebody responded to that tweet saying, "You should have paid attention at school when they taught you the concept of a rhetorical question."
It's as if they were announcing the next prime minister. And you were just genuinely going, what? There was an election?
But apart from the abusive messages, there were some politely disagreeing or some saying, I think you have a right to free speech, but it was wrong to do it before the funeral or whatever. But actually, most of the messages I had, and I still haven't managed to read all the thousands of Twitter messages, but most were either agreeing with me or saying they didn't agree with me about the monarchy, but they supported my right to free speech. And that
Did that surprise you? Because I feel like it's very easy to assume that the kind of base opinion of the general public is that doing something like that is wrong. But we also saw the fantastic protests of people holding up blank pieces of paper when someone got told off for writing "Not My King" or whatever. So was that a surprise to you?
Not necessarily. I think there is a tendency on the left to assume that the British public as a whole are all really right wing, and I don't think it's true. I think there are a range of views amongst the British public on lots of things.
Some of them are super right wing.
Oh,
some of them are just right wing. Some of them are center right wing. Some of them are just right of center.
I think then, on lots of issues.
Then some of them are Scottish.
Oh, that's true.
Or northern, as you say.
Even in England, there's the latest polling on attitudes to issues of sexuality and gender, for example, shows just how much homophobes and transphobes are now decreasing minority. But without going into all that, in terms of being surprised, to answer your question, Laura, I don't know, because how representative are people who send you Twitter messages anyway? People who send you messages by definition are people who have thought about it a bit more than others and have gone out of their way to comment. So I think people who support me are perhaps more likely to message me in the first place. But I was really, the people who said I don't agree with you about monarchy, but I support your right to free speech, I really appreciated. But in terms of being surprised, what really surprised me was some of the individuals who, some of the prominent individuals who backed my right to free speech, who were not people I am used to agreeing with. Having prominent left-wingers like George Monbiot and Peter Tatchell tweet about it, I was really grateful to them. But that's what I'd hope for.
It's kind of what they do.
Yeah. When Piers Morgan defended my right to free speech, I had you can find this online. Piers Morgan.
I can't, because in my right for free speech, I've blocked Piers Morgan on Twitter.
Yeah. Well, I had a run-in with Piers Morgan about Remembrance and White Poppies when he was still on Good Morning Britain a few years ago. I think he's now forgotten I'm me, or he doesn't remember that, or didn't realise I was the same person. But he said, I think
you're assuming quite a lot of thought and ideological purity from Piers Morgan.
Well, he said, I don't agree with you at all about monarchy, but you've got a right to say what you want to. And then Peter Hitchens, who I didn't realise was actually at the ceremony in Oxford, wrote about it from somewhere or other. And again, for listeners who don't know Peter Hitchens, he's a very right-wing.
Awful.
Very right-wing Christian and awful. Denies that poverty exists in the UK, which is possibly his most offensive thing.
Spectacular, yeah.
Hitchens said that he was ambivalent about my arrest, but that I shouldn't have been handcuffed. What sort of threat did they think he posed? He said. He also said that he could barely hear me at the ceremony, so it was wrong to say that I'd disturbed it. So, at least he was giving some true testimony. But when you say what's a surprise, Laura, that's what surprised me. It was like at one point, I think it was about 2 or 3 days after the arrest, I spoke to a friend and I said, I've worked it out now. It's a dream. the whole thing is a dream. That's the only explanation. I've got twice as many Twitter followers in 2 days. I've been asked to give an interview to a fashion magazine, and now Piers Morgan has agreed with me. I know it's a dream.
Ooh, what fashion magazine?
It was called The Face, but I gather they cover current affairs as well. So
nice.
They asked me to send them a photo of myself for the article, but they didn't use it. So
dare they? Everyone's a critic.
Wow.
How much I fitted with the other area of their work, but I won't object to that. It was very.
They didn't ask who are you wearing. They didn't ask any. No.
No. To be fair, and I've nothing against them. I mean, they do cover current affairs as well as fashion. It was just. It was just a surprise to me to be speaking as somebody who's used to getting asked for quotes occasionally from the Morning Star or Peace News. It was it came as a bit of a surprise, but despite all the attention, I would still much rather I'd never been arrested.
Absolutely.
So this leads into, we've got an actual listener question. We put a shout out for questions. This is from Ian from Shetland, who has to also happens to share my surname and my mother.
Why do we tell people this? Don't let them know.
But he's an actual listener.
Okay, he is an actual listener.
So he simply said, would you do it again?
Yes.
Good, Ian. Yes, he would.
I think I'd perhaps be more prepared for the overreaction by the police this time. And also I'd encourage people to come with me and join in, because, as you've all said, and as you said on last week's episode, several people were arrested for anti-monarchy demonstrations. There was the woman in Edinburgh, whose name hasn't been made public yet, who had a placard that said, "Fuck imperialism, abolish monarchy." There was the man arrested when he shouted out at Andrew during, as Andrew Windsor walked past in Edinburgh. And personally, I wouldn't heckle somebody who was walking behind a coffin like that. But actually, I think many people will ask why Andrew is not under arrest rather than somebody who heckled him. And then, as Laura mentioned, Paul Powsland went to London and held a blank piece of paper in, I know you mentioned this in last week's episode, Malky, about people having done that in Russia. I think it was you who mentioned it. And the police officer told him that he'd be arrested if he wrote "Not My King" on it. And then we had the senior police officers say, "We've told our officers to respect the right to protest." Is that supposed to reassure us? It's supposed to reassure us that police officers need to be told to respect the right to protest. That isn't reassuring.
Yeah.
But then we did have, when Charles Windsor went to Cardiff, I'm told by Bethan Said, who was one of the organisers of that protest, that they had about 250 to 300 people, though the BBC said 100. And nobody was arrested. Now, that's partly, I think, because anti-monarchy opinion has always been more mainstream in Wales. But it's also perhaps a sign that the police were a bit nervous of arresting people after the publicity around the arrest that had happened. But actually, it shouldn't take publicity. It shouldn't take a backlash. It shouldn't take anybody doing interviews for the police to respect the right to protest. What's shocking is the statement that they told the police to respect the right to protest. I'm not surprised, but it is outrageous. And there's so I would do it again, but I'd be better prepared. And I will do it again in the sense that when the coronation happens, I think it's really, really important that we have a big protest against that. We will be having an antiquated ceremony where we'll be required to act as some sort of feudal subjects, being told that we are to be loyal to our our king and liege lord. And it will all be worded and justified in the name of Christianity. Justin Welby, who I respect in many ways and agree with on many other issues, but not all of them, will put the crown on Charles Windsor's head. And I think it's really important not only that we all protest or speak out in whatever way we can. Obviously, not everyone can attend a physical protest. Not everyone can risk arrest. But as far as we can, we speak out about it. And particular that Christians turn out and speak out about it.
I've got an easy question for you here, Simon. I'm going to ask you to predict the future for me. Because I think I have kind of felt seeing the kind of anti-monarchist reactions at this point is that the reason that it's actually been surprising to see people see the people poking through among the kind of mass grief mourning is because the Queen herself as a figure, it seems to be so universally loved, as much as in inverted commas. Do you think that as time goes on, Charles is not as popular as the Queen was, and we're already seeing kind of people protesting against Charles? Do you think perhaps the next time we have a passing of a monarch, things will be the same? Do you think there will be more space given to protests at that point?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? I think a lot of it will depend what's going on at the same time. Whether protest rights have been improved or even more suppressed. I mean, Charles could easily carry on for 25, 30 years. And if he does, William will be into his 60s by the time he inherits, assuming we haven't had the sense to abolish the monarchy by then.
Do you think we will have had the sense to abolish the monarchy by then?
I live in hope. I live in hope, but and they talk about whether the UK will exist as a collection of nations by then. Certainly, I mean, Charles is king of 15 countries, and so I am going to make a prediction. You can I might regret making this, but in 10 years' time, I doubt he'll have half of them left. Bermuda and Jamaica and New Zealand will have gone. Others will have fallen away. There's possibly even Australia. So, in terms of the popularity that Elizabeth had, I think there's been a big effort to try and use the popularity that she had, the grief that a lot of people feel, and roll that into support for monarchy. So, the moment the BBC announced that she died, the next sentence Hugh Edwards said was, "The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral." Now, what relevance was that? That was a piece of information about somebody's travel arrangements before they played God Save the King. But of course, what it meant was that the phrase "the King and the Queen Consort" was spoken the moment that the previous Queen's death was announced. We're all to refer to him as the King straight away. And so there's an attempt to sort of roll over that grief and that enthusiasm for Elizabeth into a general support for monarchy. And if Elizabeth was so popular, if, let's say for the sake of argument, that she was really good at her job and she was really popular and she did great things, I know that's all open to debate, but even if that's all true, that isn't an argument for monarchy. That's an argument for her, because the whole point of monarchy is that you have the next person in line, regardless of whether they're any good. So, and just remember in 1969, when the MAC and militant Welsh nationalist group tried to assassinate Charles, if they'd been successful in assassinating Charles in 1969, Andrew would now be king. So the whole point is, it could be anybody. And that's, so I don't think Charles will be as popular as Elizabeth was. I don't think many people would. Her extraordinary ability not to reveal what she thought or felt about anything is a skill very few people have. And I don't blame anyone for not having it. I don't blame Charles for getting irritable with his pens when his mother's just died. Of course not. And I do blame him for dodging millions of pounds in inheritance tax.
Yes.
And so I think that royalists and the establishment will try and get us to jump straight from our grief for Elizabeth into a general appreciation of monarchy. And I hope it won't work. If Charles's faults are noticed, well, there's a sense in which I want them to be noticed, not because I've got anything against him personally, not because I think he's got any more faults than the rest of us, but because actually that is a reminder that all human beings are fallible, and you're not going to get the perfect person. You're certainly not going to get them just by having the next person in line. So I very much hope, Laura, that the next time it won't be anything like this. And, it certainly won't be after 70 years of the same monarch, because Charles would have to be 143. And even for that family, that would be a ridiculous length of time to live for.
Yeah. Even rich people don't tend to live that long. I want to quickly ask you just a really simple question, similar to Laura's, really easy. What's wrong with monarchy from a Christian perspective?
Well, I think in the Bible we see a lot of different attitudes to monarchy. I know in last week's episode you mentioned the passage where the Israelites ask for a king, and Samuel says, look, if you have a king, and although he talks about having lots of horses, he means have a big army. He's basically saying he'll conscript you. And then they keep asking, and God basically says, oh, sod it then, give him a king. I paraphrase. It's not an exact translation of the
That's
Hebrew,
in the Message, right? That's
yes, probably. And then you get this strange stuff in 2 Samuel where there's all these rebellions against David, but they keep saying that though they're against David, they're not going to kill him because he's been anointed by God, which is quite sort of pro-king. But by the time we get to the New Testament, we're talking about the Roman Empire, and early Christians were executed for refusing to say Caesar is Lord. The New Testament pretty much mocks the Roman Empire in various ways that are not immediately obvious to us now because of the cultural differences. So the Roman Empire claimed to bring peace and security. And Paul in 1 Thessalonians says, just as they are saying peace and security, destruction will come on them, which is, to the original readers, obviously a reference to the Roman Empire, though we may not relate to that now if we don't have that connection. But ultimately, I think if Jesus is my king, then Caesar isn't. And Charles Windsor isn't, nor is any politician or church or army or religious leader, nor is the Pope or the Archbishop of Canterbury or the General Secretary of the Baptist Union or whoever it might be. Not that I'm saying that
shut your mouth about the Baptist Union. My point is, I think equality and human dignity and the value of all people fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God is not compatible with the notion that one of us should bow down to another and call them your majesty. And I cannot understand, I genuinely cannot understand how anyone can demean themselves by bowing down to somebody else and calling them your majesty, basically because that person's ancestors violently seized power. Because Charles's ancestor, William the Conqueror, literally invaded England. Not sure what's patriotic about having that as a reason to follow somebody. So it is, yes, it's partly about Jesus being the only king, but to me, it's also about, if I respect all people, if I recognize that we're all equal in the sight of God, then I must try to treat everybody as my equal and not to treat anybody as my inferior or superior. And of course, I fail to do that. I fail to respect people. I fail to love my neighbours all the time.
But if we think that we shouldn't even be trying, then I find that very worrying.
Yeah. I also find it strange that people who, oh, sorry, Milky, just jumping in there, that people who would be appalled by any kind of sense of privilege or sense of superiority based on genetics would be, they'd be like, you couldn't possibly say that. It feels like eugenics, it feels like racism, or it feels like crazy talk. But then if it's the genetics of these guys, oh, well, that was, but you know who his father was, you know what I mean?
Then suddenly
right. That's important.
So I think it sets the tone for society, whether or not the monarch has any actual power, or how much power he has. It sets the tone for a society if we say that it's okay for one person to bow down to another, if we confuse respect with subservience, and if we suggest that who your parents are is a good reason to be in the position you're in, then it's not surprising that we also don't object to the fact that the 7% of the population who go to private schools end up vastly disproportionately represented in all the top jobs, and yet that isn't even treated as a major issue in political debate. If we accept inequality to begin with, then we're going to find it harder to address in any other context.
Yeah, I think that's what's weird about British or even Western culture generally, because I think if you push people on that, like, we are quite individualistic in a sense, or respect human dignity, the dignity of each person. We like the notion that anyone would be unquestionably bowing down or subject to anyone else, as you say. If you just ask people that question, opinion polls would be like, no, of course not. And it feels like there's this sense that the monarchy, or certainly with the previous queen, is kind of like a benign force. But then what you experienced in Oxford is, okay, this public space is now private. It's now ours. It's locked down, and you must all think this. And there's words as well. I think as well, they can sound ceremonial to people. But I really agree with you. I feel that sense of like, these words mean something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is going to be a clunky break as we discuss what we're drinking, because we've got beer in our name and we need to do it before the time runs out. So let's do it now.
Simon, what you drinking?
I have just finished drinking a cup of tea, which is my favourite drink, despite an allegation on social media that I was drunk when I objected to the king. I haven't had an alcoholic drink since 1997, so it must have been very long lasting if that was the cause of my protest.
Man, that is the least drunk shout out ever.
You've been sober as long as I've been alive. That's pretty impressive. Yeah.
Wow. Lolo, what you drinking?
I'm drinking a glass of red wine that my housemate offered me about 2 hours ago for my dinner, and I was like, great, that'll be my drink that I have on the podcast. So it's been breathing next to me. It's delightful. Couldn't tell you what it is, but it's good.
I'm drinking Faith Hazy Pale Ale by Northern Monk because I like the name, but it actually tastes quite nice. So that's nice. What about you, Max?
I'm drinking Moretti beer, but zero, and it's quite nice. There's not many lagers that are zero and also taste nice, and Moretti does it. So
that's
there you
a beautiful thing.
I agree with you about Moretti Zero Lager.
Nice.
Simon, can you tell us a little bit about the Police Crimes and Sentencing Bill? Why we should be terrified of it, what's wrong with it, and what people should know if they don't know about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, relating to that, the first thing I want to emphasize, I've really wanted to emphasize all this time since I was arrested, and especially since after my initial thoughts, as I gathered my thoughts afterwards, was that people get unfairly arrested all the time. Most of them don't look or sound like me, and most of them are not middle-aged white blokes like me. We all know that black and and Asian people are more likely to be arrested than white people, more likely to be stopped and searched. Young black men in particular are often mentioned. And it does worry me that there's, I'm glad there's so much focus on the arrest of anti-monarchy protesters, but arresting a young black man late at night with no reasonable grounds is as bad as arresting a middle-aged white person for saying something at an anti-monarchy protest. And I was struck when shortly after my arrest, a homeless woman in Oxford who I know slightly, spoke to me. She knew I'd been arrested, and she told me about when she'd been arrested and badly beaten up by the police. And I was left feeling upset and angry and thinking nobody's interviewing her, nobody's inviting her on the radio to talk about being unfairly arrested. So I think it's really important that we keep that in mind, that unfair arrests happen all the time. Police brutality happens all the time. And it mostly happens to people who are not given a chance to talk about it in the media. And I think now what we're seeing is, even though society is becoming more aware of police malpractice, and even though people who a few years ago would have defended the police now see the problems with them, we're also seeing a sort of police power grab as we see a succession of right-wing governments legislating to give the police more power. And so, as you say, Jonty, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which I'm going to refer to as the Police Act for short, is part of that. It introduced a whole new load of potential restrictions on protesters. Most of them are not restrictions that are imposed automatically. So you can't just go out and break the Police Act, but they're restrictions that the police can impose. So the police can designate a certain area to be an area in which protests can be severely restricted in various ways. I recommend looking at the websites of Liberty, the Civil Liberties Group, or NetPol, the Network for Police Monitoring, who both can tell you a lot more, far more expertise on this subject than I do. But the Act also introduces restrictions on Gypsy and Traveller and Roma communities. It allows the police to impose noise restrictions on demos, to break up demos because they're too noisy. And then, of course, things that allow the police to break up a protest. If you then don't agree to be broken up, you can then be arrested for that. And that's why I thought I was being arrested under that act. And they told me initially I was, and then I wasn't. Or that they said I wasn't. The police have not used the act much. It's been in force about 3 months, and they haven't yet used it much. So we're all sort of holding our breath, seeing how much it will be used. But what's really scary is that the government has decided the Police Act doesn't go far enough. And so they're introducing a new Public Order Act to reintroduce elements of the original police bill that the House of Lords threw out, which would, for example, make it a criminal offence to go equipped to lock on. So if you were planning to lock yourselves together to block a road, obviously that in itself is usually illegal because of the Highways Act, although there have been court rulings such as the Ziegler judgment last year, which when the Supreme Court said that could be a legitimate use of a road as a form of protest. But there are laws already covering that. There are things which you can be arrested under for doing that, for locking on. But locking on in and of itself is not illegal. The new proposed Public Order Act will not only make locking on a criminal offence in itself, but going equipped to do it. So if you're carrying a tube of super glue and you're carrying it for the purpose of gluing yourself to somebody in order to block entrance to an arms fair, then you would be charged with this new offence of going equipped to lock on. And that's in the proposed public order bill. So while we need to resist the Police Act, we also need to resist this proposed new bill. And that's why it's really important that if anybody hears anything about anybody being arrested or threatened with arrest under the Police Act, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, please tell Liberty or Netpol so that they can monitor how it's being used and so it can be challenged.
And as for so many of these things, the fact that it's not being used a lot is kind of like the fact that not that many people were arrested for expressing Republican views, and the police chilled out a little bit, because all they need to do is to make you feel worried that they might.
Absolutely. It's the two protesters, anti-monarchy protesters in Edinburgh, have been charged, which worries me, and I want to do what I can to support them. I've not been charged and probably won't be, but actually, whether or not we're charged, even to some extent, whether or not protesters are arrested, the fact that there have been reports of anti-monarchy protesters being arrested will have deterred some people from protesting. Understandably, I don't judge anyone for not wanting to get arrested, and for some people, it has more major consequences for them than for others. So, creating the fear of arrest in and of itself has a negative effect on freedom of expression.
Symon, I think that's all we have time for. If you had one final thing to say to Christians who are listening to this, in the UK, I think mainly, but all over the world, about protest, about offering a dissenting opinion, or even about monarchy, what would it be?
That feels like a lot of pressure to come up with the final sentence.
It's a lot of huge questions. Just pick the one that's the most important, and we'll judge you for the ones you leave out. You can say.
I've never said that monarchy is the most important issue. It sets the tone for an unequal society. That early Christians were killed for refusing to say Caesar is Lord. And there are many, many ways in which Christians in Britain and around the world now are told to acknowledge a Lord other than Jesus, whether that be a person or an institution or a system or a nation state or an armed force. And so the question that I think challenges us all, certainly challenges me, is how do we live every day with the faith of those early Christians who refused to worship the Roman emperor? Who is the Roman emperor that we must refuse to worship now? And how can we seek Jesus' guidance as we do that?
That is very wise and very profound. Thank you so much, Symon.
And thank you very much for inviting me on the podcast. It's been an honor.
Thank you for what you do on purpose, and also apparently what you do by accident.
Thank you very much.
We really appreciate it. And yeah, go well. You're listening to Beer Christianity. You can find more of us at beerchristianity.co.uk. You can find us on Instagram, on Twitter, on TikTok. Find us on TikTok, Beer Christianity, because, we don't have a lot of followers, and and it would be useful to have those since we have to, populate the platform. And check out our previous episodes about monarchy and about the Queen dying. Check out also coming up, we're going to have, an episode about Jürgen Moltmann, which I know, Symon, you're terribly excited about. But also we've got an episode with Leroy Logan, who was something of a big deal in the Met Police, and talks a lot about policing and unjust policing in the interview that we did with him at Greenbelt Festival. So check out also Greenbelt Festival. Have got interesting price arrangements. You can basically choose which tier you pay for your tickets next year, which is pretty cool. And all sorts of things like that in the Beer Christianity ecosystem that are happening. We'll be talking about that soon in upcoming episodes. So thanks so much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.